Good afternoon. So it is really been an amazing day. The conversations that we've had have been so rich, so illuminating, and like Danielle, I'm going to be thinking about these conversations for a very long time. It is my really, really great honor to be in conversation this afternoon with Gerald Torres, who's a professor of environmental justice at the Yale School of the Environment, but also professor of law at Yale Law School. But more importantly, one of the longest collaborators with the great Lonnie Grenier. And I thought the best way for us to start is to ask Gerald to tell us as many stories as you can muster about your long collaboration with Lonnie, beginning with when you met her.
Yeah, well, I met her when she had just left the NAACP, the Inc. Fund,
Mm-hmm.
and had taken her job at Penn. And there was a critical race theory. Can I say that word?
Go ahead. It's already out there.
A critical race theory workshop that we used to have them every summer,
Mm-hmm.
and we were meeting at Buffalo. And it's funny because we met. And she said, I don't understand anything you guys are talking about. Right. So, that was my first encounter with her. And then my second encounter with her was she sent me a manuscript that became Becoming Gentlemen and asked me to look at it. And so I started editing it, right? And after 3 pages, I realized that basically there wasn't any words that Lonnie had written left. So I stopped because I said, I don't really know this woman that well. And I sent it back to her. And she said, I got it. She said, and 2 hours after I came off the ceiling, right, I realized, oh, this is better. So why'd you stop, right? And that was our first real kind of co-authoring, even though I was not a co-author of Becoming Gentlemen, where we started to work. And then we, I encourage everyone to try to co-author stuff with people. What Lonnie and I used to do, it was kind of a lot like this. We would, when we were writing, she would write a piece, and then the way we would present it is she would present it, and then I would respond to that. And then I would present what I had written, and she would respond to that. And we'd go back and forth, and then we would invite the audience to comment. And that's kind of the way we wrote, actually, by constantly interrogating one another. Trisha's recollection of the event here at Brown was important. I want to underline this because Lon and I had several convenings, one at Brown, one at Harvard, one at Yale. I think we had one other one, I can't remember where we brought together not just other disciplines, but we brought together artists, journalists, musicians, right? And what Lonnie said is, look, we've got to learn how to talk across all of these groups, and we have to be able to talk to the world, right? And if we're just talking in an academic setting, we're not going to learn how to do that. So I want journalists here who can tell us how we can, communicate more clearly. And that's how we got Breon there, right, as part of that. Tim Mitchell, who was also in drama. Tim's actually the one that introduced us to Augusto Boal and Boal's pedagogy, or Theater of the Oppressed. Theater of the Oppressed, right? Which builds off of Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And we played. I mean, and I actually think play is an important part of it, because it means that you have, it's not that you don't take the ideas seriously, right? But you play with them, right? And that means if someone offers you a critique, it's nothing about you, right? It's about the idea. And you have to learn to present them clearly and hold them lightly, right? And we did that. And Lonnie was willing to take an idea and run with it, even then, and say, oh, that didn't work. But for those of you who've read The Miner's Canary, I urge you to go look at this, because Lonnie and I wrote about the person who is currently the mayor of LA. Right? We wrote about Karen Bass when she was a community organizer, because the politics that Karen Bass was articulating as a community organizer, it corresponded to what we were trying to do, articulate in The Miner's Canary, right? So I always said Lonnie was one of the rare people who could actually see around corners.
See around corners,
right?
Okay.
And that's kind of an example of it.
But tell me one thing about that. So, how was your work received? In the two law schools, you were you were at Yale. She was at Penn.
At that point, I was at Texas.
Yes, you were in Texas.
I was at Texas. Well,
right.
It's hard. Texas is a different. How many? Any Texans here? No, because Texas, Texas is a funny place, right? It's you talk about the 10% plan. That grew out of conversations with Lonnie and Penda Hare, who may or may not name mean nothing to you in the audience, but Penda Hare is she's the one who managed Lonnie's appointment process, and was a colleague of hers at the Inc. Fund. She now works with Reverend Barber down in North Carolina at Forward Justice. And as our mutual friend Pam Carlin once said to me, she's the only one doing weapons grade voting work in the country, right? But Penda and Lonnie and Dana, come on, I can't remember Dana's last name.
It'll come to me in a little while.
Yeah, okay. Would meet and regularly and talk. And one thing Lonnie really did stress is, and I think she learned this from Richard Dixon, is you got to have a place. You got to make spaces to sit and talk. Right. That's critical. If you're going to organize, you have to make a space where you can sit and talk. And so the 10% plan grew out of some stuff that we were working on in The Miner's Canary when we were just thinking about the idea. But let me put it in context. Texas is 48% Latino. I was the first tenured Latino at the University of Texas Law School. Right. Right. So my situation was a little different than Lonnie's, right? In that there was, despite, it felt a little more constrained, but Lonnie and I, were in conversation, and I brought her down to co-teach a class with me at Texas, which she did. We've taught 9 classes together. I went up to Harvard to teach a class with her. We taught a class together at Yale. I can't remember where else we taught, but several times at Harvard, a couple of times at Texas, once at Yale. But at Texas, she actually, her faith in the idea of the 10% plan was in some ways instrumental to getting it, to articulating the arguments that would prevail.
So say more for folks who don't really know what happened.
The Texas 10% plan, I want to say now that because of the Texas 10% plan, and I'll explain what it is in a minute, I was doing the calculations when you mentioned it earlier. About 180,000 students will have now graduated from the University of Texas who would not otherwise have been admitted to the University of Texas under the old system, right? Now, what the 10% plan, Texas, there was a case called the Hopwood case, which outlawed affirmative action. in Texas. And the judge, when decided that, had this kind of interim decision, because he said, not only is taking race into consideration not permitted, but if I think any of you are cheating, you're going to be personally liable, right? So we'll take your house, right? So so if you were an administrator, it's like, we got to be really careful. So we said, well, look, and I got a lot of criticism for this, I will say. I said, look, right now, 75% of the seats in every freshman class come from a handful of high schools in Texas, the suburbs around Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, and Houston. And we said, well, that's crazy, because Texas does have a state constitutional obligation to equalize spending in public schools. So we said, look, we just think anybody who graduates in the top 10% of an accredited Texas high school should be permitted to enroll in the flagship universities. And so people said, well, that's not, you can't do that. You can't do that. I mean, that's, people who go to Del Rio aren't nearly as prepared as people who go to Alamo Heights or Highland Park. It'll devalue. And I said, look, you're required to spend and equalize the quality of their education. If you haven't done that, that's your fault, not the kids, right? So I want you to go visit their parents and tell them, because I haven't done my job, your kid can't go to the University of Texas. If you're willing to do that, fine, I'll retreat, right? But the other thing, and Lonnie was helped me discover this, there were two counties in West Texas, which are pretty white, that had never sent a student to the University of Texas.
Wow.
And they were represented by conservative Republicans. So we went out there and said, you've been paying taxes for 120 years to support the University of Texas. It's a shame that no one's smart enough in your entire county to go to the University of Texas. And so these rural conservative Republicans suddenly were locking arms with the representatives from the Fifth Ward in Houston, right? So yeah, we did talk about that, and it passed, and it survived basically every year for the first 10 years. Every year that they were in session for the first 10 years, they would try to repeal it,
right?
And it was always defended by the politics of the miners' canary, right? Where we said, look, rural Texans have as much in common with the Mexicans and the African Americans who are denied admission. And the other thing, and this is the other thing that you can find this in the research, the students who performed best are African American women who were admitted under the 10% plan.
Wow.
And so and we made everybody take the SAT.
SAT or ACT?
Either one, right? But it wasn't used, but we wanted to assess where people. And so kids who were 200 to 300 points below the people who other students were outperforming them, because what the transformation occurred when the admissions deans realized that they thought, I'm the dean of admissions, I know how to assemble a class, and suddenly they realized they didn't, right? And if I can tell one more story about that, right? It's like I was blessed by having an admissions dean there who was a devout Christian, and he felt like it was his mission to make Texas open, right? And so, the fact that the other thing we said, and Lonnie was important to this, is that you have to, if you think institutionally, you recognize that all of the leaders in Texas in business, law, medicine, politics,
right,
come from UT.
Yes, exactly.
So if you segregate UT, if you resegregate UT,
Mm-hmm.
right, you're going to end up resegregating all those institutions as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't just an admissions to college decision.
Right.
This is a decision about what the leadership of the state is going to look at. They're still fighting that today, right? And I want to remind people, right, that Texas wasn't desegregated until 1971.
Yeah, that's a good reminder.
Yeah.
That's a really
and
good
I know
reminder.
young people in
Exactly.
here will think 1971 is ancient history.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to tell you, it is not ancient history.
Right,
Right.
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 But you didn't answer my question about, so how did it happen? Did people at when Lonnie moved from LDF to Penn, did they react to this kind of work, or did people react to your work?
No, I think they. Well, Lonnie did voting, her early voting stuff.
Right.
Right. There was no better voting person in the country. Okay. And what they responded to, or maybe didn't quite appreciate, is how Lonnie's participation in the amendments to the Voting Rights Act. That work was really instrumental, right? And so she could explain how the Voting Rights Act worked, but then she started talking about democracy, and those are different things. And that's when some people at Penn said, this is political theory. It's not law, right? And her answer was very simple. It's not that I'm against majority rule. It's just that I don't think 51% of the people should have 100% of the power. Right. So it's not that you don't get to set the agenda if you win the election, but that agenda doesn't mean that everything's going to happen just because you want it. Right. So what she was interested in exploring was how you democratize power. Right. And that makes people nervous.
Well. Right. So I want to move from that, because you're pointing to the book that before we talk a little bit more about the Midas Canary, the book that I like the best, which is Becoming Gentlemen, and that's her co-authored book with Michelle Fine and Jane Balin. And one of the things that they speak to in that is can we use the negative experiences of some women in law school to initiate fundamental changes in legal education? And that really, really resonated with me, because I've been involved in trying to get the scientific establishment in this country to deal with the persistent underrepresentation of minority folks in or people of color in U.S. science and technology, the whole big infrastructure. And all the time that we've been fighting this, which is now 40-something years, the issue continues to be, well, we just have to get more people of color through the pipeline. And we fought really hard to get them to stop saying pipeline and say pathways. So that was number one. And then number two, we just have to hire more women faculty, but they didn't necessarily mean women of color. They meant that women in all of this work for a very long time only meant white women.
Right.
And so, but the thing that really helped me in many conversations with Lonnie, she was saying, but the students of color are not the only students who are not being served by a kind of scientific education, those big, introductory gut classes where the expectation is 2/3 will fail and that's fine. And a lot of the students of color fail and they didn't care. But she said, what this is about is changing that, not necessarily trying to just, quote unquote, save the few who are getting through that competitive scientific technical culture of education is the crux of the matter. It just blew my mind. So we can stop talking about fixing the people of color and talk about the structure of this kind of education, because there are plenty of white people who don't want to be an engineer because they don't like it. They don't like the way you're taught there. They don't like the way you're made to feel there. And we could not wrap our heads any way around how we could get past that point. And after she and I talked, I'm like, oh my goodness, that's the point. This is the wrong kind of education if we want to get the talent of people who want to do this kind of work.
That's exactly right. I mean, you have to ask yourself, and this is what Lonnie was especially good at, right, is for whose benefit were the systems that we're currently integrating created?
Right.
And if they weren't created with you in mind, then you're always swimming upstream,
Mhm.
right? You're always swimming upstream. And so what it leads you to do is to critique the systems that within which we have to operate, and to recognize that they're connected structurally to other things, right? So uh, Becoming Gentlemen was a really controversial book in law
Yes,
schools.
I suspect, right?
A colleague of Lonnie's, and Lonnie repeated this to me, so I suppose I won't identify the colleague, but said, "I will rip the face off someone who wants to change my law school."
Okay, then.
That's a fairly rough. That's a fairly rough. It's like if you like your face, it's but a colleague of mine in Texas threw the book across the room and said, a few choice words, right,
Mhm.
about how it was wrong and didn't apply. Wasn't willing to discuss it,
Uh-huh.
right? Was willing to throw it across the room,
Right.
right?
Right.
Uh, and to me, all that said is, oh, she's on to something here, right?
Mhm.
Because if it elicits that kind of reaction, right, then it is touching the right nerve,
Right.
right?
Right.
And Lonnie and her co-authors, I think, were brave.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the other things about it that I like, and this speaks to something that's, I think, been critical in all of your work and her work, is it starts with a powerful story. It starts with her story returning to Yale Law School for this event, noticing all these, framed pictures of old white guys on the wall, and her own personal reaction, and recognizing the ways in which she had been silenced during her time at Yale, when everybody else was saying, "Oh, I had a wonderful time when I was at Yale. I still remember fondly all these different things." And she said even the radicals were saying, "Yeah, it was really great." And she felt so completely, you know, uh, different
Right.
and outside of that the narrative of everybody was saying. But she at that point hadn't quite found out what
What was making her
what was
uncomfortable?
making her uncomfortable.
Right.
Yeah, I thought it
Well,
was a really powerful story. But you guys use stories in such incredible ways in the work.
it would be great, right? Lonnie and I worked together and argued with each other for 30 years. I mean, a long time, To if I were to take her arm and walk her through the Yale Law School right now, the portraits that are on the wall are no longer all white men,
Hmm.
right? And Lonnie, I would argue, is instrumental in making that change, so that the student sitting in this seat looks up and sees Sonia Sotomayor,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Sees black women, sees black men,
Hmm.
right? As well as white men. I mean, there's white men too, right? But they've now instituted an entire wall where photographs of graduates of color historically are their portraits are on the wall, right?
Hmm.
Photographs, right? So the changes at the Yale Law School reflect some of the things that Lonnie raised in that book. And I feel funny because she and I had completely different experiences in the Yale Law School,
Uh-huh.
right? I actually loved it.
I bet she would teach you about that.
Yes, she would, right? And part of it is like the difference was, and I never really asked her about this. Is I found a couple of faculty who treated me like an intellectual,
Hmm.
right? Which was a really critical thing. And so that's one of the things that made my experience. I don't know if Lonnie ever got that
Hmm. Hmm.
in law school.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I think that um, if you look, I mean, you answered the question I was just about to ask you, how that work actually changed the law school. It changed it physically with those new additional photographs and representations of people of color who've been there and made important contributions. But did it change? Did it have any impact on larger legal education?
Well,
Because it was, as you described, the reaction of people throwing it around.
oh yeah,
There was visceral
oh yeah.
reactions to that book.
No, there was absolutely visceral reactions to that book. I think it did, but Lonnie recognized that law schools, the law is a hierarchical profession.
Mhm.
That legal education is a highly hierarchical profession. So when she talked to the leaders of Yale and Harvard, said, "Look, if you're not willing to make the changes, no one in that hierarchy is going to feel empowered to make those changes. But if you make the changes, you can have, that's what leadership looks like."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that's one of the effects she had. I think, Lonnie often said that our writing's important, but our true legacy are our students.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not an accident that the dean of the Yale Law School is the person that Lonnie brought into Harvard. And
Yes.
while she wasn't exactly her student, she was a mentee while she was, getting her footing in legal education.
Mm-hmm.
And it reflects, she reflects the values that Lonnie conveyed. I will say, and I'm willing to accept checks now. We've created a scholarship in honor of Lonnie at the Yale Law School, and it will go to a fund underrepresented law students for admission. So
that's a great tribute to her. So I want to talk more about this pedagogy, because once you say what she says in Becoming Gentlemen, that it has to be these fundamental changes to legal education, and she starts doing it. You guys start doing it. Your pedagogy doesn't look like anything that came before it.
One of the things I wrote, right, is that to teach courses with her is to witness kind of ceaseless experimentation, right? So if you learn one way to do things, you can do it again and again because you get better at it. She was always using the classroom to explore questions. So those slides that Trisha showed,
Yeah, right.
Those came out of her use of kind of theater techniques to get students to do stuff. She would have these things which, if we were to start to enact them now, you would think we were crazy, right? But she had one that she liked to do, which was take these chairs, right, and rearrange them in a way that makes one more powerful than the other. What the heck is that? Right. And so then she'd have a group of students do that. And suddenly the chairs would be rearranged. They'd be piled up into pyramids and, or something. They'd be stacked in a line and one would be, but she wanted people to embody the learning they were, experiencing. So it wasn't just in your head. Right. That life is lived in the world, not just in your head. And what her experimentation in the pedagogy was also an experimentation in sharing power.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Because most of us, I'm speaking for myself, right, are loath to give power away, right? Especially when you've struggled to get that power, right? But Lonnie was saying, look, what I want to do is I want to empower all of the students in the classroom, to take responsibility for their own learning. Hey, I'm the expert. I know the material better than they do. There's no question, right? But the actual learning that occurs, they've got to own it, right? And so her sharing of power was a way to get them to own their own education. This was really important.
Were there any students who hated it?
Oh, undoubtedly. They didn't take our class.
Okay.
I will say the one thing, I taught property. I don't know if there's any law students this year, but I taught property every year for 25 years. And finally I was just sick of it, right? And Lonnie said, I only teach classes students want to take. So she didn't teach any of the first year classes.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, okay, that's going to be my new approach.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to teach the required courses. You know, I'll teach classes students want to take.
Right.
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 And of course, for Lonnie, that meant any class she was teaching.
Exactly. Exactly. Everybody was
She
trying to
could have
get in her
taught property,
classes.
and it would have been,
Right.
they would have
Right.
signed
Right.
up for it.
Right.
Right.
Right. Everybody wanted to be in her classes. So again, I want to come back to, well, the last convening we had at Harvard, as you recall. So toward I guess she was already emeritus at the law school when we did this. Was a convening after she had become ill, and we talked to her about what kind of convening she wanted. And I remember her saying that, she just wanted her students. She didn't want a lot of faculty to come, even the faculty that were old friends. It was like she just wanted her students. And we convened it. And the first thing we're doing, chairs are moving, all kinds of tables are moving around. And I get destabilized by some of that. I was sort of like, oh my God, she's going to make her just do that stuff. Oh, goodness gracious, still. And she was very attuned to it.
You remember it.
And the stories that come with what she asked us, what the program that we all put together.
Right.
We had a few panels, but mostly we did a lot of standing and dancing. And
right.
we did a lot of dancing. And it was just, at the end of the day, it was so memorable. I think that it was just, and she was present for most of it, the majority of it, until she was pretty tired by the end.
Right.
But it was a real reflection of how many people we had to cap it. Remember, we couldn't let everybody who wanted to come, and these were former students of hers who had benefited so much from her work and her teaching and the classrooms that she created. And it was so wonderful to be able to recreate just a tiny slice of that for that last time.
Oh, absolutely. No, I remember that vividly, that whole back of the room.
Yep.
There was one exercise where she made people march around, and then they had to stop. And I can't remember what but imagine us marching around or to get the whole room here, right, up on your feet and engaged and acting, right? She did that.
Yeah.
Right?
She did.
But it was to a purpose, right? It wasn't
exactly.
just, wasn't just because she could do it.
Right. Exactly. It was really, really special. And I think at the end, I was curious about the ways in which she was also, and both of you were so committed to, sort of the central points in the Miner's Canary. Would you say that was the book that captured really the heart of the matter for her work, for what you guys were so focused on for so many years?
I think so. I mean, I think a lot of the work we've done since then, right, is to take some of the ideas in it and try to expand it. So the thing we're working on, which I hope to finish, is a book on the role of social movements in creating durable legal change, which of course grows out of the Miner's Canary, right? And that work, you could take any of the stories in the Miner's Canary, the union story, the 10% plan, Karen Bass's work in LA, and for those of you who haven't read the book or don't remember that story, right? There, she had to engage. Karen Bass was challenging the old line civil rights community in LA, because she said we've got to change the way we think about power, right? If we're going to change the institutions to accomplish what we want to accomplish. She's saying that as an organizer, right? But that's what a lot of the stuff that Lonnie and I continue to work on was that. And it's about democracy, right? And she took democracy very seriously. She took democracy, not populism necessarily, right, but democracy really seriously.
I think that's right, and I want us to talk a little bit about the confirmation situation. You're going to shake your head. Yes.
Yeah. No. We were both there, right? People forget we were both nominated for positions in.
Oh, that's right.
In DOJ.
Oh, that's right. And so the first time that I met Lonnie, to have conversation, extensive conversation, was when we had the Black Women in the Academy conference at MIT, 1994. So the fall of '93, I think, was most of that had happened.
Dana
Right?
Cunningham.
Hmm?
Dana Cunningham.
Yes. And so we had three keynotes. We had Lonnie Grenier, Angela Davis, and Janetta Culp. But Lonnie was first. And it was after she had not been allowed to speak publicly, certainly during the beginnings, when not the hearings, but before while they were deliberating on whether to pull her out of the confirmation process altogether. And so she hadn't been able to speak. And all these terrible things, I think Danielle referred to some of the things that were being said about her that were so awful, such mischaracterizations, that she wasn't allowed to speak. And so she walks into Black Women in the Academy conference. There are 2,500 folks there. 90% of them are African American women and other women of color. And she starts to talk and she said, my husband told me not to cry. And all these women started yelling, girl, go ahead and cry. You can cry in here. It's the right place to cry. You need to cry. And she just stood there, and then she cried. And then she did this incredible speech about it. And it was so important to all of us that she was finally able to speak. And just because we were organizing the conference, we called it African American Women in the Academy Defending Our Name. And some people objected to the defending our name part, but we felt that she had been put in that position where her name needed to be defended, but she couldn't do it. Right? So part of us highlighting her and giving her that first keynote was about recognizing what an extraordinary historical moment that was. And so you want to say more about that?
I commend you and thank you for that, right? Because that, it was a traumatic moment. And some of you who've known Lonnie or seen photographs of Lonnie, there was a period when you may have noticed that she used to wear these big hats. But the reason she wore those big hats was so that she wouldn't be recognized, right? So that she could kind of hide, right? And she said, paparazzi, sticking their camera in her car, right, is a terrifying thing. Somebody comes up and sticks, you don't know what they're doing, right? Mm-hmm. But she was sufficiently traumatized that she adopted these big hats, right? Which, some people might have thought was just a fashion statement, but, she said, no, it allows me to kind of hide when she has to be out in public. I mean, that's the degree of the trauma that people don't appreciate, right? And then to have your work consistently mischaracterized, right? Intentionally mischaracterized, right? And she and I used to joke, right? I said, Lonnie, if the right wing had really read your work, what they would have done is they would have the people who would have been opposed would have been the Congressional Black Caucus, because she was challenging single member districts, right? Mm-hmm. Majority, because she said they would have been, but it's proof that no one had read this work, right? Because what she was, when I said she was keeping her eye on the prize, the prize was increasing democracy for those people who have been excluded from the process, and making sure that institutions in the distribution of power have democracy as their lodestar. That's why the stuff on merit is of a piece mm-hmm. with their stuff on democracy. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. But no, it was people. She lost weight. I mean, she was suffering, and I understand, if I kind of consider this kind of nakedly politically, mm-hmm. right? That the reality is that she was a stick that the opponents of the president could pick up and beat the president with. Right. 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 what injured her was that she understood that the president could pull her nomination. That she wasn't, is that he didn't defend her
Right.
at
Right.
all. Right? He didn't defend her at all. Right? And he might have said something like, "Look, the political costs we have to pay are too great. I understand that she would have been great, but I can't do it." Right?
Mhm.
Even that would have been better than the things he did. People. There were only two white people invited to her wedding.
Mhm.
Bill and
Both
Hillary.
named Clinton.
She wasn't named Clinton then.
Yes.
Bill and Hillary,
Yeah.
right? So they were deep and old friends, right? And to be just cast to the wolves, and I mean almost literally to the wolves, was a deep betrayal, and it wounded her profoundly.
No, I completely agree. But I have to say, the thing that I was probably more impressed with the fact that she began to weather that. At least we thought her being recognized in Black Women Academy was a push for a way of surrounding her and validating her contribution and recognizing what had happened. But when she came to Harvard, I think she be, Lonnie became the mentor of mentors. I mean, there wasn't a student. It didn't matter whether you were a law student or undergraduate or anybody. If you went to her to talk about your concerns and what was happening in the institution, how to think about staying true to your work, she was going to talk to you.
Right.
And she was very skillful at talking to the students and other people, and not talking about herself.
Right.
It was tell me more about your story. Tell me more about what you're thinking. And there's so many stories from her students about that and other people as well. But she really was a very strong advocate of certainly all people of color, but particularly I think for African American women at Harvard. She was just extraordinary present. But the thing that I also appreciated, you would have thought somebody might have been wounded to the point of not being able to continue to fight the good fight, but that is not how she was at all. She was still really, really serious. And I saw her take on some of the leadership at Harvard at different times, and she was fierce. She was really, really fierce, and she did not take any prisoners, to the point where, you thought people would say, "Oh, well, you think Lonnie's going to be invited to that reception?" It's like, no, she's not going to be invited to that reception because she's going to make everybody uncomfortable. And the thing that I remember her saying to me, I would say things like, this makes me, I don't know if I can do X or Y or be in this situation or reception or things like that. And I'd say it's too uncomfortable. She said, "You know what? It's okay for you to recognize that you're going to be uncomfortable in these spaces. And then you have to figure out how to face that and what you're going to do about it." Right. And she would always say, you have to do something about it. You can't just rest in this space and say, "I'm just uncomfortable and I wish I wasn't here," or "I wish I could do something else."
Right, exactly. No, I mean, that's exactly right. And I think, if you reflect on kind of lessons learned from the appointments debacle, mm-hmm. right? I think it would have been one like that, mm-hmm. which is, or it was being present in that way that her disappointment, as she called it, right, mm-hmm. reinforced. I mean, there's this old story she used to tell about Mrs. Buxton. And Mrs. Buxton, there's no reason any of you should ever heard about Mrs. Buxton, but Mrs. Buxton was her fourth grade teacher. Right. We had a blue-haired teacher who started class talking about our founding fathers, right? And so Lonnie raised her hand and said, "Well, I don't think we should celebrate Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, right? These are people who owned slaves, and Thomas Jefferson sold his own children, right?"
So she was 9 years old.
She was 9 years old, right? And got into a back and forth with her teacher, right? She lost that one, right? But she felt she needed to say, "Look, No, this is not okay. This is, it doesn't mean we have to disrespect them, but we have to tell the truth about them, right? She didn't use those words, obviously, as a 9-year-old, right? But similarly, in junior high school, when they integrated her school, right, and she suddenly had a bunch of girls, black girls, from a different school coming into her class. Like, she said, I felt like I needed to make a space for them and defend them because they were intimidated by the class. So she recognized that she had a leadership role to play to make a space for these other girls, right? So they wouldn't feel excluded from the classroom that she was in. This is middle school, right? So we're not talking about, her talking, speaking back to the president of Harvard, but if she's talked back to Mrs. Buxton, the president of Harvard is nothing.
Yeah, that's exactly how she approached it. This is exactly how she approached it. So, what do you think she would have to say about this particular moment? The AP course, the critical race theory attacks.
She wouldn't be surprised.
I believe that. Yeah.
No, she wouldn't be surprised. I think Lonnie was clear that, and this is why we started our work on social movements, is that unless you got ideas out of the academy and onto the street, right, the ideas don't have as much power as they could have. And the only way you make change is by ensuring that the people themselves have the tools to make change. So the rise of the right, the anti-critical race theory movement, the kind of things that are happening in Texas, the statute they passed, I think it would disappoint her, no, without any doubt, but I don't think she would be shocked. Right. I mean, because what she recognized, and I made that joke about Richard Nixon earlier. What she recognized is the right's been making a space to talk to each other and to organize since Barry Goldwater lost to Lyndon Johnson. Mm-hmm. Right. So Lonnie was very clear that things don't happen overnight. Right. There's a longitudinal quality to producing change, and sometimes you don't win. In however but just making the arguments plausible, right? Even if they lose, is an important step. And what she wanted to kind of help empower people to do is to have the courage to make the arguments even when they don't prevail. And so I think she'd be terribly disappointed. I mean, she would not be surprised, but I think she would say, part of it's our fault. Right, because we haven't been doing the organizing we should be doing.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of voting rights, what do you think about? Do you think about this turn toward the return of states' rights to continue to pre-clearance gone? That was already happening, but
yeah. I think she would be for people who don't remember, right? The amendments that Lonnie worked on, the 82 amendments, right, were critical for removing the obligation that you find a intentional discrimination in voting, right? So that you could use an effects test to prevail. The backlash to that victory was immediate, and so I think Lonnie focused on state rules for organizing power, and I think she would have thought that we didn't spend enough time in the states organizing to defend power, and relied too heavily on the federal government. Mm-hmm. She also knows that the courts, the role of the courts, is one of the things that have been transformed, and she would want to see power in the legislatures, where we can have an effect, and not depend on the.
So, in a sense, she was asking. She would have been thinking hard about what the Republicans and conservatives actually accomplished, which
Yes.
was to take the power away from the feds and put it back into the local settings, but with them having the majority.
Right. Right, exactly. No, she looked at what they were doing and said, "There's lessons there for us to learn."
Uh-huh.
Right.
Hmm.
And the values are we'll fight about those, right?
Hmm.
But there's like on the ground organizing that has to be done. So like let's go back to the 10% plan for a
Sure.
minute, right? What Lonnie realized was we needed champions in the legislature, but we also had to get in our cars and drive out to West Texas, drive to Houston, drive to San Antonio, drive up to Dallas, and meet with community groups and meet with them because the a lot of people had adopted the ideology of merit in the way that the legislature was trying to
Hmm.
promote. And what we had to do is to shake that loose. Right? We shake that loose. Let me tell you one other story that Lonnie, because Lonnie helped me do this. Lonnie and Penda again. Penda is unsung heroine, and they were thick as thieves. They were. There was a magnet program in Austin when I was living in Austin. And what they wanted to do was to have a law magnet. So the students there would study law. And Lonnie said, now this is your chance to use the law school to produce change in the school,
Uh-huh.
in the middle school,
Hmm.
right? So we used their desire to have the magnet school in the middle school to transform education in that school, right? Consistent with the 10% plan. We said, look, we will not oppose your effort to have a magnet school so long as the magnet benefits every student in the school, not just the students who are in the magnet program, right? And then we created something, created a monthly parents coffee with the principal,
Hmm.
but we did it by creating a space outside of the school where the principal would have to leave the school to meet with the parents, right? Because a lot of the parents of these kids had their own bad experiences at school.
Right.
So it
Right.
intimidated them to go sit in the principal's
Mhm.
office. And Lonnie said, look, I want them talking about educational philosophy. But if you tell these parents, you're going to have a conversation about educational philosophy with the principal, none of them would show up.
Right.
But what they would show up to talk about how their kids are getting educated, right?
Mhm.
And so Lonnie said, look, these institutions are nested, right? So you take the power of the UT Law School and use it to change this middle school. And then let's see if we can't make a model for that for other schools, right? So.
And also, it seems to be. I mean, that to me, it's just it's just making my mind spin at that actually the liberatory aspects of the changes that we are trying to get to, and that kind of plan, that kind of innovation that you just described is actually again what they did, what the other side did.
Oh yeah.
And you just go, wait a minute, why did they do it, and why didn't our side do that? This is a problem here.
Yeah, and it, I'd say the difference between the two sides is Lonnie was committed to democracy, not just power.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I don't think the other side's committed to democracy. I think they're committed to power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think so too. Before I ask you the very last question, um, I want to know if you want to reflect on then how she came to be so committed to this sort of across the spectrum of her work. That you can't have this sort of one size fits all in any kind of educational setting. You have to figure out some way to get to be innovative enough, to have enough courage to try enough different things so you can capture everybody. But it's not going to be this one thing
Right.
that can be used to capture everybody.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One is she really was committed to innovation when opportunities presented themselves, right? She was also committed to looking around, seeing what's worked in other places, and asking, could that work here? If it can't work here, let me give you another example. Southern Echo. Do anybody know Southern Echo? Southern Echo is a group in Mississippi, and what Southern Echo created, right? In one way, the common technology for generating candidates is you have a community group, a party that tries to identify people who would be good candidates. What Southern Echo did, and what Lonnie loved, right, is they created something what they called a followership school.
A followership school.
Right. So not a leadership school, a followership school. So we'll identify candidates, but we're going to identify candidates who know how to do what their constituency wants them to do. Mm-hmm. Right. And so this idea that Lonnie and I created called constituencies of accountability, mm-hmm. right, is what she was committed to. So that in every institution, it'll take different shapes and it'll be experimental, but what you're always creating is a constituency that can hold power accountable, mm-hmm. right, in whatever institution you're in. Mm-hmm. And it's going to look different from place mm-hmm. to place, because she understood deeply that the material circumstances within which change is created is radically different, and you've got to be nimble enough to deal with that, right? Mm-hmm. And that, she was a great theorist, yes, right? But she was also a theorist of democratic experimentation, mm-hmm. right? And that's what I think a lot of people don't appreciate about her work, right?
So, the anniversary of her passing recently. So what's the best thing you remember about her? The thing that you come back to, you started laughing. The thing that comes back to you that just warms your heart when you think about her.
Oh, what? Lonnie was committed to fun. Like
and she was funny.
And she was very funny. And a lot of people probably don't recognize that, right? Or who knew her or only knew her as being fierce wouldn't appreciate that she had a great sense of humor, right? She loved a good meal, yes. right? She loved, she liked going to movies. She liked just taking time off for herself and having fun. And so being with somebody who is committed to enjoying life, right? Is one of the things I miss, because there's a vivacity to her that when you think of her just in the context of what her contributions to the academy are or to scholarship are is lost, right? I mean, she loved going to Martha's Vineyard, yes. right? I mean, she loved going to Martha's Vineyard. She would tell me stories about places that I can't even name right now that she grew up with and loved, right? And part of it was it was a family place that mm-hmm. and it was there's a Black community there, yes. right? Really, really important to her, yeah. right? So recognizing the importance of both preserving and enhancing Black community spaces mm-hmm. was really, really important to her. Mm-hmm. She's also, I mean, the way I put it this way, right? That though the specific subject matter may differ, and I wrote an essay about all of her work, right? Her eye was always on the prize. How shall we govern ourselves in a way that is consistent with our highest and best values? How shall we make the system open enough to reflect the pluralism of the good and to ensure that the right shall make the good possible?
Wow.
And I think that summarizes Lonnie's work.
Oh, thank you so much. We have some time for some questions from the audience.
I'd be happy to answer any questions unless they're personal. No questions?
Yeah, I actually do have a question. I'm curious if Lonnie and Bill ever reconciled.
No, I mean, I'm sorry. The answer would be no, right? I mean, a story that I don't know if, I guess I can tell the story. She told me, I don't know if she's told other people. Sorry. Bill said, look, Lonnie, I'd do anything for you. Look, if you need $5,000, I'll lend you the money. Right. So he offered to lend her money, right, as he was booting her out of the consideration. It shows a degree of restraint that she didn't publicize that, right? Or throttle him on the spot,
Exactly.
right? Although he was president, so she would have gotten in bad trouble. But but I mean, when I say that she felt betrayed by Clinton, it was personal. It was was personal. I know Bill Clinton's ancient history now, but he and Hillary are really smart, right? So the idea that they didn't know her work is completely implausible. Completely implausible, right?
But I remember her. She did speak eloquently about that when she went down she thought they were going to get behind her and it was going to go forward, and it didn't. And she talked about that long train ride back to Philadelphia.
Right. Yeah.
It was really difficult. Anybody else? Danielle?
If you had to write a new chapter of Miner's Canary with Lonnie, what kind of examples would you pick?
Great question.
I think we would talk about the ways in which race has been in the conventional definitions of race have been re-weaponized by the right? And Lonnie always had this idea that one of the way we describe racism, right, as measured by the distance from blackness.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, the way racism works is to create a category of blackness and make it a category that you don't want to be part of.
Exactly.
Right. So you want to, the farther away you are from the category black, right, the whiter you are. And I'm using white and black in very, stylized terms, right? But Lonnie was also said, look, white people are really afraid of losing a majority.
Yep.
So what they're going to do is they're going to try to increase the size of the category of whiteness to protect that numerical majority in the electoral process. And so the pressure on blackness and the way racism will be expressed is going to become more intense.
And it has.
And it has, right? And I think if we were going to write another chapter, we would write about that process because she and I talked about this, and we wrote about it a little bit in. There's a book called The New Black,
Mm-hmm.
and we have a chapter in there. We wrote about it in there, right? But the idea of political race was really destabilizing and scary for some people. Right, because you can think of it this way. The reason we chose the metaphor of the miner's canary was that, in some ways, the way race functions in our society is diagnostically. So that if there's some institution that's not working for Black people, the chances are really good that it's not working for other people too. Mm-hmm. And so what you've got to do is identify who those other people are, because those are your political allies. Mm-hmm. And then you've got to figure out ways to make them your political allies. Mm-hmm. And as long as people try to inscribe the old racial script is designed to divide people who can challenge power, mm-hmm. right? And so I think the new chapter would be on that. It would not be a happy chapter.
No. In the back.
Who do you think that Lonnie
I couldn't. Sorry.
Who do you think that Lonnie would admire from today's activists and find hope in?
Ruth Gilmore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think she would. I think Ruthie would speak to Lonnie's understanding of a lot of the issues.
Mhm.
So I think just to choose a name out of the, if I only had to choose one, I'd choose Ruth Gilmore.
I think she would. I think she would be really supportive of Ketanji Brown too.
Oh no kidding, no. Yeah, I was thinking of in the academy.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
are you?
yeah,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, she. Two people. One is Sonia
Yeah.
Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown. Absolutely, because she would know what those women are
Are
putting up
going
with.
through. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, and I can't imagine. I mean, I hope they, I wish them a long life and low blood pressure.
Yeah. Right.
That's a good wish. I'm interested in hearing from both of you of what you would think Lonnie would have to say about the rights co-opting of the civil rights playbook in this time.
Say more when you mean the co-opted the Civil Rights Playbook. What do you?
Like the ways that they're exploiting some of the strategies of civil rights to reinforce whiteness that probably couldn't be made up in numbers, right? Or white supremacy, let me say that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you want to speak first.
Okay.
I mean, I think. Parents involved, right? I don't know if you know the case. The case is it's a case both coming out of Kentucky and Washington State, in which the school districts there were using taking race into account to ensure that the distribution of students in the districts would be relatively balanced, so they wouldn't have completely segregated schools, and it was declared unconstitutional because by Justice Roberts. Because he focused on that one line from Dr. King that everyone pulls out of context, right? And that's where he first uttered the phrase, which he didn't cite the derivation from it. The way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, right? So what Lonnie and I were trying to understand was, how was it possible that idea was, which was the anti-discrimination idea, the anti-subordination idea that was at the heart of Brown, how did that get transformed into a legal principle that would be used to disadvantage people of color, right? She would recognize it as a systematic ploy of the right ideologues. And she would say, we haven't done our job, both in the academy and in the street, right? To ensure that the message of Dr. King's speech is not misunderstood and misappropriated, right? That if you're going to use one of the great icons of liberty and justice, then we have to reclaim what liberty and justice mean, right? And so I think Ketanji Brown's interrogation of the lawyers, I can't even remember the case.
In the recent cases.
In the recent case, yeah.
Was
Lonnie would have loved that.
Oh yeah,
Lonnie would have loved that, right? Because okay, we're going to use historical technique to limit what our decision can be. Okay, then let's talk real history.
Yeah.
Right. And so she would have loved that. But I think Lonnie would be committed to, she would be dismayed, but she would say, we've got to get back to work.
I think I would answer it this way. I really love Lonnie's emphasis and focus on getting everybody well, not everybody, but her focus on the stories. And she would say, we need more people to tell their stories about how this system works and how it's actually disenfranchising them. How the pain of it, the long time stress that we carry because we are harboring these stories. She ordered me to buy a micro recorder because she would say, "You're not telling your stories," and I'd say, I don't have time. I can't. I don't have time to write." When did you get the recorder I told you to get? And I said,
Did you?
No, no, I didn't. She bought me one.
Oh, good.
She bought me one. She said, next time I saw her, she said, "I know you didn't buy it. So, come by my office and it's going to be there. Get the recorder." And she said, because these stories are the way you are going to make sense out of what is happening. But then it was all about, the faculty retention and all kinds of stuff like that at Harvard, what was happening to the undergraduates, how this whole Asian American students versus the Black students issues were playing itself out on the ground in the houses with the roommates and things like that. She was always sort of layering it all up, and having been dean, I knew a lot of those stories, and she was like, "You have to tell these stories." And that's the thing that I am left with, how important it was for her to have as a theorist, but it was a kind of, to use a kind of trite term, a kind of grounded theory.
A completely grounded theory,
Had
right.
to be. These stories are not simple. They represent the complexity of the issues that we have to solve. And she was so committed to that. And that, I think, is something that I carry with me from her all the time.
No, I want to underline that because, I met with a group of young Latino scholars, right? And what I said is, pulled out my little notebook, right? Said, carry that with you everywhere. When you go on a walk, when you're walking the dog, when you're, shopping, carry it, because when you have an idea, you think you're going to remember it, you're not going to remember it, right? You have a story, you want to sketch some ideas, sketch it out, right? It's just something that only you're going to see or only you're going to listen to. So don't censor yourself, right? But write it down because you won't remember it, right? And I would encourage everyone to do that. One other person that Lonnie would admire, but she doesn't know, she wouldn't have known him yet, and that's Femi Taiwo, Olufemi Taiwo.
Who writes about reparations?
He's got a great book, which I would recommend everybody, called Reconsidering Reparations. And he's resurrecting, in a good way, the Cedric Robinson and work on racial capitalism. And he tries to explain how we've got to understand all of the institutions that we currently inhabit as expressions of the colonial project that began 500 years ago, right? And I think we also have to keep reminding people, even young students of color, right, that we have come a long way.
Yes.
We have come a long way. And we've come a long way against incredible odds, and that, you can make institutions that are committed. You can change the commitments of institutions, but you've got to work at it. And you have to recognize that the powers that drive the commitments of institutions are often outside the institutions and are part of that, the process that Taiwo identifies as the kind of residue of the colonial process that began 500 years ago. And so, you're not going to win every time. You're not going to lose every time, right? But all we can do is support each other and work.
Yep. On that note, she would end this by saying, "Now you've got to get to work."
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you.